For this lecture, we're going to take a few moments to examine the idea of personhood and how that concept relates to abortion. So we'll start by defining our terms. What is personhood? The question of personhood is actually essential to understanding the ethics of abortion. If you don't understand this concept, then you won't be able to contribute meaningfully to any debate over this issue, regardless of what side of the issue that you're on. And it turns out that when it comes to whether we're talking about beginning of life issues or end of life issues, the idea of personhood is one that frames our understanding of moral status. So moral status just means what qualities does a human need to have to be considered to be a person that has moral rights. And so there are 5 primary theories that your text points out, and these are standard theories. It's not something that Christians have come up with. These are just standard theories that come up in bioethics. So any textbook on bioethics would break down the different theories, something similar to what you would have in your textbook. And the first moral status theory would be called human properties. So when you look at these different 5 theories, all these mean is if you have these properties, then you're considered a person. The human properties theory says if you are a human being, that's it, then you're considered a person. It doesn't matter what other qualities that you have, how tall you are, how short you are, how young you are, how old you are. If you are a human being, then you are considered a person. And so moral status is something that is given to every human that is considered a person. Human properties theory says that's just every human being. So every human being has moral status, means that every human being has rights that should not be violated. The second moral theory that comes up is what's called cognitive properties theory. So this says, yes, being a human is an essential quality that someone needs to have to be considered a person, but it's not the only quality. There are some humans that don't possess moral rights, and cognitive properties theory says that you also have to be able to reason. If you can reason and are a human, then you're considered a person. Moral agency says if you can make moral decisions and you're a human, then you are a person. Sentience is similar to the idea of cognitive properties. It's a little bit distinct, but the idea of sentience just says if you are conscious. So if you have any degree of primitive awareness, you have a first-person perspective. That's all it means to be conscious. You have a first-person perspective. You're aware of something. Then you are a person. Someone who can reason is maybe somebody who is able to think about the future, which is a higher level of consciousness. That's what it means to have cognitive properties, is you have a higher level of consciousness. Sentience is very minimum. It's just if you are conscious and you're a human being, then you're considered a person. And then the last theory of moral status is the relationships theory. And this one basically says if you're wanted and you're a human being, then you're considered a person. So now, before we even get into the ethics of abortion, it would be important to read the sections in your textbook on these 5 different primary theories to make sure that you understand them well. It would make sense to figure out what are the pros and the cons, what are the problems with the different theories, because really your understanding of the pros and cons of these different theories will influence your understanding of the ethics of abortion. So when we take these theories into, we might say, a life timeline, it helps us understand what's at stake in the issue of abortion when it comes to beginning of life issues, as well as, we'll talk about this in a later section, something like physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia when it comes to end-of-life issues. So here is the primary question when it comes to personhood as it relates to abortion. So we know, like science tells us, when biological birth begins, and science can tell us when biological death happens. The question of abortion is, when is somebody considered legally alive or morally alive? Does it happen at biological birth, and does it end at biological death? Or is there somewhere in between that the status of being morally and legally alive happens? So someone might say, when cognitive functions begin, that's when somebody is considered morally alive. And on the other end, if someone loses all cognitive functions, so this is the cognitive properties theory, you might say that that person has lost all rights of having moral status. So this is somebody who is maybe in a irreversible vegetative state. That might be considered somebody who is biologically still alive, their heart's still beating, their body's still alive, but when it comes to their moral status, they're not considered morally alive because they're not considered a person. So hopefully that life timeline helps you understand what's really being debated when we're talking about the ethics of abortion. Similarly, when we're talking about the ethics of something like euthanasia. So the central question then really is, when does a human being become a person? Now, one of the things that I think is important to point out, and oftentimes students make a mistake when talking about this, is that this is not a scientific question. If we were just dealing with scientific questions, the only thing we know scientifically is when human life begins and when human life ends. That's something that can be determined using the tools of science. When it comes to the central questions involved in abortion, these are philosophical questions. So, are all human beings considered persons? That's a philosophical question. Does personhood begin sometime after a human being begins? That's a philosophical question. And this is important to point out because oftentimes, those who are proponents of pro-life, so I would consider myself to be a proponent of pro-life, will frequently be accused of saying, well, this is a religious question. It is a religious question. I actually think all positions in this debate are religious at bottom. But the alternative is usually seen as being science. So science versus religion. I just don't think that that's the case when it comes to the topic of abortion. Everyone's position is philosophical, or you might say religious at bottom. And so we need to reason through the philosophical questions when it comes to this topic. So let's do a little bit of background. So I'm jumping out of our textbook for a moment, and I'm looking at another standard ethics textbook that you might find in a university. It's Louis Vaughn's book, Doing Ethics. And he gives some background to abortion that I think is helpful for this lecture. And so we'll start with some terms, just defining terms that come up in Louis Vaughn's text. So the first term is induced abortion. So this is the intentional termination of a pregnancy by either surgical or medical means. So by medical means, it means with drugs. That's usually what we're talking about when we're talking about abortion, is induced abortions. That's the ethics that we're referring to in this discussion. There are other terms that can be related. So miscarriage is another word that sometimes gets brought up in these discussions. This would be considered an unintentional termination of pregnancy, either due to medical disorder or injury. So this is not part of the ethical dispute because it's unintentional. It's something that happens through means that we don't bring about through any just intentional means. It's unintentional. Another term that comes up is called therapeutic abortion. This is abortion performed to protect the life or the health of the mother. And this is a question that can be brought into the debate or the discussion as well when it comes to the ethics of abortion. Other terms that are important to discuss are terms like fetus. So this word refers to the unborn during the entire development from conception to birth. So when we use this word, it refers to the entire pregnancy. Every trimester, we could use the word fetus to talk about the baby in the womb. It really is just the same thing. And development, furthermore, begins at conception or fertilization when sperm enters the ovum and the two merge into a single cell called a zygote. A zygote contains a complete set of 46 chromosomes, half of them from the mother, half of them from the father. And it takes 3 to 5 days for the zygote to reach the uterus, where it grows in a tiny orb of cells called a blastocyst. And by day 10, the blastocyst fully implants itself into the uterus. And so, again, these concepts, these words are important to know just by background. Embryo, the stage of development, this is the stage of development from implantation until 8 weeks after fertilization. And during the embryonic phase, most major organs form, though the brain and the spinal cord keep developing through pregnancy. And the embryo grows just to over an inch long. And so pregnancy can be broken down into 3 trimesters. And so this is important to keep in mind. First trimester goes up to 3 months. Second trimester goes up to 6 months. And then the rest of it goes up to birth in the third trimester. And then the last term that's worth considering is viability. So this is the stage of fetal development at which the fetus, again, we're just talking about a baby at this moment in the womb, is able to survive outside of the uterus. And with current medical science where it's at right now, this is around 23 to 24 weeks. And I say this is where current medical science is at. You can imagine as medical technology increases in the future, this can become earlier and earlier. So with that background, we might consider some moral and legal questions. And there's, everyone knows at this point, this is a hotly debated topic in our culture right now. And this has been a debated topic for a very long time. I remember debating this in high school, and it was a topic that my older siblings debated, my parents debated. But the moral question is simply the question, is abortion morally right? The legal question is, what should the law allow? And sometimes there's a debate when it comes to moral versus legal questions where there are some people who will argue that morally they think abortion is wrong, but legally they think abortion should be allowed. You could say, for example, morally lying is wrong, but there shouldn't be any law that outlaws all cases of lying. Maybe some cases of lying, but not all cases of lying. And so as you're working through the ethics of abortion, it's important to think through what's the relationship between the moral question of abortion versus the legal question of abortion. Well, as of late, as of June 2022, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, which erased the 1973 decision stating that abortion is a constitutional right. And so what that means now is that each state determines whether abortion will remain legal. And so the moral debates that we're having in our culture right now are deeply influencing the legal debates. And as of this recording, there are 41 states that have some restrictions on abortion. 13 states have a total ban of abortion. And then 28 states restrict based on gestation. So with that background, it might be helpful to consider some moral arguments to see if one side makes a better moral case than the other. So we'll start with a pro-life argument for restricting abortion or getting rid of abortion altogether. So the argument could go like this. Premise 1, the unborn is an innocent person from conception. Premise 2, it is wrong to kill an innocent person. 3, abortion is the killing of an innocent person. Conclusion, therefore abortion is wrong. Whenever you present an argument of any type, it's important to examine the premises first to see if the premises lead to a logical conclusion. If the premises stack up in such a way that the conclusion follows necessarily from the premises, this is called a valid argument. When it comes to the pro-life argument, you will be able to assess whether this argument is valid or not based upon the phrase, an innocent person. So one of the main questions that comes up in this debate is this phrase being used in the same way through each step of the argument? This is a big question. So the unborn, in premise 1, is an innocent person from conception. Well, one way that you can make this argument is to argue for the human properties theory. And if you argue for the human properties theory, then you would say, yes, we have an innocent person from conception. So then you move on to premise 2. It is wrong to kill an innocent person. Well, now here is the big question in this debate. The big question is, does the phrase innocent person mean the same thing in premise 2 as what it means in premise 1? Some will argue that an innocent person in premise 2 is not referring to the human properties theory, but it's referring to something like the sentience theory, or perhaps the cognitive properties theory, or some other theory that would signify that when most people talk about how it's wrong to kill another human being, they're talking about somebody who is aware of their existence. Now, that's what you have to wrestle through when you're wrestling through the pro-life argument. So I want to give you some arguments in support of this way of arguing to see if you find them persuasive. So first, let's see if there's a good support for premise 1. One support that is often given is that there's no unambiguous point of personhood which could be located in fetal development. This is one of the big problems that comes up for those arguing for pro-life. How do you decide when personhood begins? And if we can't determine it in an unambiguous way, the most reasonable thing to conclude is that personhood just begins with conception, which again is the human properties theory. But if someone says, well, I still don't buy that, there's another way to talk about personhood if you don't buy the human properties theory, and that is to just add the idea of potential to your moral status idea. So if someone holds to cognitive properties or sentience or some other theory, you could make a case that someone is considered a person if they have cognitive properties or if they have the potential for having cognitive properties. So this sometimes distinguishes beginning of life issues from end of life issues. So some who argue this way will say when it comes to end of life issues, if somebody is in an irreversible vegetative state where they have lost all consciousness, is it okay to let someone die in that situation? Well, in that situation, you could make a moral argument that says, since there is no person there, since there's no cognitive properties there present, or no sentience there, it is okay to let the patient die. Why is it okay? Because it's irreversible. Those cognitive properties are not going to return. When it comes to beginning of life issues, however, somebody who is pro-life could say the relevant difference is that at the beginning of life, there's a high degree of probability that even though the human being does not have cognitive properties yet, they will if you just give it a few months. That is the big difference between the two. Second support for premise 1 would be something like this. At conception, we see the appearance of a complete human genetic code, DNA. And so that is just arguing for the human properties position. If you're going to make an argument, just start, when does human life begin? It begins at the moment of conception. And so this idea tries to focus on scientific definitions for life, and those who argue this way, oftentimes they don't even like the argument about personhood. They'll say that all of those other theories are just philosophical theories, and so instead we should focus on the only one that is scientific, and that is, when does human life begin? Now, as I said at the beginning of this lecture, I still think that this is a philosophical argument, but it is the one that, if you're going to try to offer only scientific evidence, the only scientific evidence that could be offered in this debate is, when does human life begin? The second question is, does all human life have equal value? That's the philosophical question. But sometimes pro-life advocates want to give this case and argue that it's just a scientific debate. Well, what about the arguments for pro-choice? A pro-choice argument could go something like this. The unborn is not a person until birth. Premise 2, it is wrong to kill an innocent person. Premise 3, abortion is not the killing of an innocent person. 4, if abortion is not the killing of an innocent person, then it's morally permissible. Conclusion, therefore abortion is permissible. Now, a few things to point out about this argument. First, I always like to highlight that what's usually not in dispute is premise 2. Both pro-life advocates and pro-choice advocates argue that it's wrong to kill an innocent person. They debate about what is an innocent person, and more specifically, they debate premise 1. So is it true that the unborn is not a person until birth? Well, there are some questions that you have to consider when wrestling with premise 1. So if you say, yes, the unborn is not a person until birth, the question is, does this imply that the unborn is not a person even an hour before birth? Because the baby could survive outside of the womb. And some pro-choice advocates will say, well, of course you have a person then. It's sometime earlier in the pregnancy. But if so, if you say, yes, it's not a person an hour before birth, well, what's the physiological or psychological difference between the born and the unborn? Where is the magic line? If it's not 1 hour before birth, is it 10 hours? Is it 10 weeks? The line seems arbitrary, which brings up question number 2. What is the most responsible way to develop a definition of personhood that is not arbitrary? In other words, how do we make sure that we're not just making stuff up in this debate? I think this is actually the biggest challenge that pro-choice advocates have to wrestle with. How do you make a case that doesn't rely on we're just making stuff up when it comes to when personhood begins? Since there's not a scientific point that we can point to, how do you determine when person? Is it convenience? Is there a sound, philosophical, principled way of making this argument? That's the challenge that pro-choice advocates have to wrestle with. But there are other pro-choice arguments, and here's another one that many will find convincing. So this one's a little bit longer, so we'll spend some time working slowly through this. So premise 1 of this argument goes like this. Whether or not the unborn has a right to life, it does not have a right to sustain its life by using the mother's body against her will. So this argument, notice in premise 1, that it's not even really concerned about the personhood debate. Maybe the unborn is a person, and maybe the unborn does have a right to life. That is a different moral consideration than considering whether it has the right to use the mother's body against her will. Premise 2, the mother has a right to defend herself against the unborn's use of her body against her will, which is a right to have an abortion. So even though the unborn may have some sort of right to life, that does not mean that the unborn has a right to use the mother's body against her will. 3, the unborn does use the mother's body against her will when the pregnancy is, say, the result of rape or incest or some sort of defective contraception. Therefore, abortion is permissible in cases of rape, incest, or defective contraception. So this is a pro-choice argument that's made for specific cases. rape, incest, or defective contraceptions. Now, some pro-choice arguments say they don't like that it limits it in this way, but this is one case that could be made for pro-choice. Judith Jarvis Thompson was actually one who made this argument, and she wrote, "Even if we grant that the fetus is a person with full moral rights, abortion still may be permissible in certain cases, more cases than the conservative would permit, and fewer than what a liberal would permit." So those are just a few arguments to consider in this discussion. So to quickly just recap what we talked about, when it comes to the ethics of abortion, the 5 theories that you need to understand for this chapter that's relevant for the discussion board, that's relevant for your assignment, is to understand these 5 theories: human properties theory, cognitive properties, moral agency, sentience, and relationships. If you understand these theories, that will help you understand more about the ethics of abortion.